The line was almost around the block when Pinky showed up. She strolled right past a throng of stallions, all with numbers around their necks, and every one of them stared at her as she walked by. She smiled at them and gave a big wave before she ducked inside, making sure the door closed behind herself and she disappeared. Pinky's face was bright and smiling as she surveyed the bakery interior. Sugar Cube Corner had been renovated. All the furnishings and decorations had been cleared out to leave a giant, empty-looking area in the main waiting room. The counter was still there, mostly because it was built in, but the area behind it had been cleared out too to make room for a big corkboard. There were already a whole host of things stuck to it. The numbers 1 to 100 on the left-hand side under the label Waiting, and on the right-hand side, an empty section labeled Finished. Pinky beamed. As she went alone into the sweet shop, Applejack and Rainbow Dash were both there, both of them leaning against the corkboard with their eyes half closed. Applejack pulled herself from her resting position and onto all fours. She walked over to Pinky and tugged slightly at the brim of her hat. "Y'all ready, Pinky? Crowd's been getting angsty waiting for you." Pinkie Pie nodded enthusiastically. "Sure am! I've been looking forward to this all week!" Applejack turned her eyes in a half roll, but nodded to Pinky and made her way to the door. Rainbow Dash seemed to find the energy to pull herself from the wall as well as she stepped around the counter to Pinky's side. She put a hoof on Pinky's shoulder as Applejack pressed her face to the doctor's peephole, taking in full sight of the line waiting outside. "Y'all sure about this, Pinky?" "Wait, no, that's not Applejack." "You sure about this, Pinky? I know you like making other ponies happy, but this seems a bit much. Even for you." Pinky shook her head, unable to displace the smile that came with her wherever she went. "I'm super duper sure! I said I was gonna break my record for most ponies happy in a day, and by gum, I'm gonna do it!" Applejack pulled her eye away from the peephole and readied her hooves at the door handle. Making folks happy is one thing, Pinky," as she said as she began to turn the handle. "But this is a little odd." Now it was Pinky's turn to roll her eyes, which she did with gusto. She blew a breath of air through her nose and with a disdainful sounding pfft. "Come on, Applejack, it's not a big deal. Every pony knows that there's nothing that makes colts happier than getting their fun stick in a mare's party place." Rainbow Dash made a gagging face in Applejack's direction behind Pinkie Pie's back, and Applejack rolled her eyes back at it. "Fair enough, Pinky, but why do you have, swallow it all?" Rainbow Dash finished, evidently more comfortable with the particulars of description than Applejack was. Sure enough, a hint of pink emerged on Applejack's cheeks a second after Dash's interruption. "Well," Pinky said, her tone exaggerated, as though she was explaining the simplest thing in the world. "That's just so it'll be more fun. Besides, I can't let every pony shoot their stuff inside, or I'd wind up Prego in the Yago." The what now?" Applejack asked. Rainbow Dash shook her head behind Pinky's back, trying to give the signal that regardless of the answer, the question itself wasn't worth it. "Never mind," Applejack said, and returned her attention to the door, as she threw open with a sort of finality. "All right, every pony, come on in. Don't make a mess on the floor or you're getting the boot right off the bat." The throng of onlookers with numbers around their necks murmured amongst themselves and began to make their way inside. True to Applejack's admonitions, every one of them made sure to check their hooves before they stepped into Sugar Cube Corner. One in particular, a pudgy, almost buttery-looking colt near the back of the line, scanned his hind hooves obsessively and almost toppled over as he held one of them up to check for wayward grime. Finally content with his level of cleanliness, he walked inside and found his place in the horde of quietly muttering stallions of various shapes and sizes. As the crowd threatened to fill every inch of the cleared-out room, Pinkie Pie bounced up from the center, hovering inches above the milling bodies, and held her hooves to either side of her mouth. "Welcome, every pony!" she shouted, loud enough to provoke an uncomfortable grimace from the nearby Rainbow Dash. "I'm so glad you all can make it to what's bound to be the most fantastically super spectacular fun for everyone time in Ponyville has ever seen!" "Or at least the guys in Ponyville, anyway," Dash muttered under her breath. Applejack caught the aside and matched it with a smirk. Pinkie Pie landed and walked up to the side of the crowd, where she signaled AJ and Rainbow Dash with a nod. Applejack sucked in a deep breath and filled her lungs before raising her head and turning towards the crowd. "All right, you lot, listen up. She managed to be loud without screaming, her voice commanding enough that every colt and stallion in attendance turned and looked, including the tubby one in the corner who was still worrying over his hooves. This is how things are going to work. There should be 100 of you here. Assuming you all got your numbers right, in a few minutes we're going to get started, at which point you will conduct yourselves in as courteously as possible to Pinkie Pie over there, who's agreed to do something so nice for all of you in the first place. Pinkie Pie smiled and waved to the crowd of stallions, many of whom waved back timidly. Applejack sucked in another breath before continuing. When any pony finishes, Pinkie's going to call out your tally, at which point you'll come up to this here board and hand in your number. You're free to watch afterwards, and maybe even join in later if Pinkie's feeling up to it, but nobody goes more than once till everyone's had at least one turn. You understand? A murmur of yeses burbled through the crowd, the general tone sounding like a chorus of schoolboys being lectured by their teacher. Good. Now, with all that being said, Pinkie, have y'all got anything else to add? Pinkie Pie shook her head, still smiling. Nopey dopey! Just one more thing. Pinkie turned around to the crowd of colts and grinned at them. Just remember to have fun, every pony, she said, and the herd of male ponies answered her with semi-enthusiastic cheers. Applejack and Rainbow Dash shared a glance, but nothing more than a smirk. Well, Pinkie, I guess you're running the show now. Good luck. Who needs luck? Applejack smiled in spite of herself and made her way behind the counter where Rainbow Dash was already waiting. The two of them took a spot up on either side of the board and looked towards Pinkie, who was almost bouncing with enthusiasm. All right, boys, she said, turning around to point to her end squarely to the crowd. Who wants to go first? Amidst the echoes of quiet murmuring and half-hearted eagerness, a sound made its way forward from the corner that was noticeably louder and more urgent-sounding than anything else in the room. Pinkie turned her head to peek over her back in the direction of the sound, and Applejack and Rainbow Dash did the same. They stared open-mouthed as the chubby colt who had been checking his hooves touched himself in front of them, pawing awkwardly at his diminutive equipment. He closed his eyes and grunted again. Though Dash and Applejack couldn't see the lower part of his body from behind the counter, they could see his hips buck, and the look on every pony else's face as his body jerked. Are y'all kidding me? Applejack said aloud. Half the ponies in the audience chuckled, despite the way Applejack's brows furrowed and her face flushed. The chubby colt came back to himself suddenly. He moved his hooves away from underneath his pudgy belly and returned to a proper four-legged position. Sorry, he said with a voice that sounded like a nighttime pizza in years of speech therapy. Do we gotta start this whole thing over again, 'cause Johnny Quickshot over here got himself all hot and bothered just from a quick peek at Pinkie's cooter? Applejack asked. The chubby colt covered his face with one of his hooves, his cheeks flushing quickly from Applejack's public shaming. Nope! Pinkie's voice rose up from over the counter, followed by Pinkie. She had been out of sight to both the ponies by the board, and they watched wide-eyed as she stood, sitting over the holding in her hoof a tiny cup filled with a vicious-looking white liquid. Pinkie Sense wins again, she said, and tilted her head back. The cup in her hand flew towards her mouth, and she caught it in both hooves, letting the sticky, not too substantial payload sail right into her tongue. There's just something awfully disgusting to me about women drinking semen straight from the cup. I mean, it's bad enough. I mean, don't get me wrong. There's nothing particularly wrong with a woman swallowing, but oh God, it's just nasty. It's just straight up nasty, man! Have you no shame? Anyways, she held it out for every pony else to see for the moment, and brought it inside her mouth and swallowed a second later. She said. Not bad. She grinned at Applejack and Rainbow Dash. Both scorekeepers shared a shocked back-and-forth stare as the chubby pony trotted shamefully over to the counter. He removed his number from his neck and handed it to Rainbow Dash, who awkwardly lowered into a bin behind the counter. With a similar stupefaction, Applejack moved the number to the other side of the board under Finished. Who's next? Pinkie said. She didn't need to waggle anything anymore. The sight of her swallowing a glass full of cum had evidently been enough to perk up the interest of more than a few stallions in the crowd, and as several of them stepped forward, raising their hooves and mumbling meekly. Pinkie didn't need them to admit it. She could see their eagerness plain as day, in varying sizes swinging underneath their stomachs, waiting for her attention. Now we're talking, she said. Pinkie pushed her way through the few stallions that had stepped forward and found her place at the center of the crowd, turning after she reached the middle of the room and looking back towards the half-hard stallions who had volunteered themselves. She lowered herself to the ground, bending at the knees, and opened her mouth, letting her tongue hang out to the side. Behind her, one or two more stallions felt a sudden rush of blood between their legs, most noticeably the section of the crowd immediately behind Pinkie, and therefore treated to a proper display of her butt and other parts of her anatomy. One of the stallions who'd stepped forward initially did so now, walking towards Pinky's open mouth with more trepidation than seemed necessary, given the particulars of the situation. Pinky only invited him forward with a nod of her head and twinkling bright eyes. His hooves slowed as the last few inches of proximity to his stallionhood neared. Pinky pulled her tongue inside her mouth and smiled at him.
"Well, come on," she said. "There's no need to be nervous. Get over here so I can give that thing a good suck."
That last word I said didn't really sound...
A good suck.
My Pinky voices.
Suck.
Yeah.
Suck.
No, that sounded like a sock. Okay, well, I'm just going to stop here. The stallion seemed even more anxious at Pinky's request, but he did as directed and walked close until he was standing over top Pinky, his full-strength erection at the perfect level for her mouth to meet. Pinky giggled to herself, and then did exactly that. The stallion groaned as Pinky's lips wrapped around his cock, followed by her mouth proper, and then her throat. Pinky bottomed out on the stallion's shaft while batting an eyelash and hummed loudly as she swallowed the whole of his dick. She swayed her head from side to side as she sucked and raised one of her hooves to the stallion's balls, which she pressed into softly, squeezing them with a feather-light touch. This was all too much for the stallion, and evidently in a fashion he hadn't expected. His eyes widened in a sort of surprise, followed by panic as he realized how sudden and consuming Pinky's technique was. His mouth opened, but no warning came before his hips jerked, and the part of his cock not inside Pinky's mouth shivered as he blew his load. His balls clenched against Pinky's hoof as she massaged them, and her hum turned into a murmur of as she swallowed the 4 spurts of cum the stallion had in before his cock began to go limp. Pinky pulled her mouth off his rapidly deflating wang with a smile. "That's 2, she said, and held her hoof up to the crowd. The stallion ambled his way towards the counter, his face red at the realization that an entire crowd of ponies had watched him blow his load in less than a minute. He removed his number from his neck, and Applejack and Rainbow Dash added it to the board. Now that one pony had been given proper attention, 1.5 in the earlier shooter's cum shot swallow counted, the crowd in general seemed less nervous about the arrangement they had gotten themselves into. Another stallion stepped forward almost immediately after Pinky licked her lips to clean the traces of errant jizz from them, and she smiled at him as well. He was considerably more well-hung than the first pony had been. Pinky's eyes went wide, and she smiled even bigger as she looked up at the stallion in question.
"Oh, goody! A big one! This'll be fun!"
The stallion smiled back at Pinky as he stood over her and offered his sizable stallionhood forward. Pinky took a moment to appraise it, tilting her head to the side and looking over the many inches waiting for her. "Gonna be tricky," she said. She dove forward without another word, and the stallion groaned in spite of himself as Pinky's mouth went wide and she swallowed the first half of his shaft without effort. Pinky rested there for a moment, keeping her lips locked solidly around the stallion's wide shaft, and she made an approving-sounding noise before she squinted her eyes and tried to move further forward. The stallion craned his head to look underneath his own stomach as he felt the wetness of Pinky's tongue slathering along his shaft, moving further and further down with no sign of stopping until finally, with his eyes wide in disbelief, he felt Pinky's nose pressed against his crotch. Pinky made a contented-sounding noise with the stallion's cock in the back of her throat. She let herself rest there for a second before she moved her head up and pulled off the stallion's cock with an exaggerated, "ah."